Welcome to this short video on how to teach Chapter 6 on discipling youth from our Discipleship for Church Leaders Training Manual. The purpose of this chapter is to identify the essentials for discipling youth in the church. Some of the key points we'll talk about. Number one, youth ministry is not entertainment. Number two, discipling youth requires teaching and engagement. And number three, youth need to be taught the tough issues and how to handle them, because these are things they face in their everyday lives. Some notes on this chapter. We're going to emphasize biblical principles, not church traditions. We're going to develop youth as leaders. This is the first step in developing leaders within the church, is to start when they're youth. And third, how to provide adult support. Like our other chapters, this chapter begins with a scripture and an introduction paragraph. And again, you can either read that paragraph or paraphrase it for the participants in this particular session. In this chapter, we do begin with an opening question to talk about what youth ministry is, where you can get the participants to discuss what they all think it is that will help shape your thoughts about how you go further and teach this chapter. The first section, we talk about effective youth ministry. And we talk about what youth ministry is not, and then we talk about what it is and why we do youth ministry within the church and some key points about youth ministry. And we bring out 9 components of a purpose-driven youth ministry. In this next section, we talk about the development of young adolescents. Young adolescents experience more profound growth and changes in their lives at this particular stage of life. So it's important that we address those as we're discipling youth. Number one, they begin to notice the variability among their peers and how different they look or might not be different or are the same, etc. They start noticing differences. They start developing concern about their appearance. Also, we talk about how their patterns of thinking begin to change and how the environment and media start having an impact on their lives and their thinking. In this next section, we talk about how youth learn. And the first thing we talk about is how youth need to feel okay, both physically and emotionally, in order to learn effectively. And then we find that youth find it easier to learn when the teaching matters to them. If it's just some, distant principles and things that don't affect them too much, they're not going to listen. But if it really matters to their lives, they'll tend to listen more. And it's easier for youth to learn when the environment is active. So you might want to consider games and other activities that cause the youth to interact with one another. And youth will also need to work on these skills over time. Things just don't happen very rapidly. It takes time to develop some of the skills that they're learning. And finally, youth learning requires adult support. They need people around them to encourage them and support them in their learning process. In the next section of this chapter, we talk about the eternal purposes of discipling youth. And what we're talking about here is how they can display their Christian faith in all areas of their life. We also need to talk about the tough issues, the things they face in their schools every day, healthy behavior, risks and consequences, emphasizing the difference between temptation and sin, and also about good decision making, because they're going to be faced in this life of making decisions perhaps for the very first time. And as their parents and adults, we want them to make good decisions. We also want to teach them about how to become leaders for the cause of Christ. So at this age, we're starting to develop youth as leaders amongst their peers. And that can be as a Bible study leader or as a group leader, maybe even as a worship leader. So there's various ways that we can help youth develop into the adults that they're going to be one day by starting to develop them as leaders as youth. The final section of this chapter, we talk about developing the next generation of church leaders. And we recognize that the leaders of tomorrow are the youth of today. So we want to start developing them now for the leadership roles in the church that they will probably have in the future. And one principle we like to talk about is that what youth don't like today, they will change in the future. They don't have the power to change it now, but they're storing away knowledge about what they would change if they ever got to a position where they were in a position of decision-making within the church. So they're already formulating some of the things they like and don't like about ministry and what changes they would make if they became a leader in the future. And finally, we emphasize about teaching biblical principles, not church traditions. Again, what we want them to know is what the Bible teaches about things, not what the church traditions have been or what the secular culture believes is the way to go. But make sure they're following God and following His principles as laid out in Scripture. Finally, we have an exercise in this section as well. And this is just an opportunity for the participants to make a list of the main points that will help their church in their youth ministry. You can also do some brainstorming to come up with some off-the-wall ideas of what might be helpful. Thank you for watching this video on Chapter 6 on Discipling Youth from our Discipleship for Church Leaders Training Manual.